Hey friends, I'm in a hotel room in Kansas City, Missouri, and I just heard that Jerry Lee Lewis has passed away. I can honestly say that Jerry Lee Lewis is the artist who I've listened to more than any other in my lifetime, which feels weird to say that out loud because he's not my favorite artist, but he was my dad's favorite artist. And Jerry Lee Lewis's country records are the soundtrack of my childhood. Almost every day, my dad would put on those country records, and playing on the weekends, my dad would get drunk and sing along to the Jerry Lee gospel stuff and the country records at the top of his lungs. And there's something about Jerry Lee playing gospel music. I'm not a religious person at all, and I don't typically like most gospel music that I hear, but when Jerry Lee Lewis would play gospel music, you could feel this tension. You could feel that I truly believe that he believed every single bit of it, and he also realized that he was completely unable to live up to any of it. And you could feel that tension in that music, and I think it made for beautiful, beautiful music. Hank Williams' gospel music, I think, is the same way. And it's the only other person I can think of off the top of my head, although I'm sure there are other examples. But man, my dad loved Jerry Lee Lewis, loved the killer. He got to see him a few different times, and it was always in some dive somewhere. It's when Jerry Lee's career wasn't going as well. And he got to see him, I believe it was in a place called The Grove in Beech Grove, Indiana. And my dad got to walk up to him afterwards and shake his hands. And he would talk about that for years. You know what? I got to shake the killer's hand. And I said, what was it like, Dad? And he said, well, he had the softest hands of any man I'd ever met. He said, softer than any woman. You could tell he'd never done a day's work in his life. And as a person who worked every day of his life, he thought that was a pretty good thing, like Jerry Lee got over. But, when you talk about him being tormented of knowing what he thought was the right way to be and not living up to it, like when I read a couple of his biographies, you could see a lot of that in childhood. I'm going to forget the age. It seemed like he was 10 or 12 years old and playing piano in a brothel. And you can just imagine what kind of a twisted view of the world you might gain by doing that at such a young age. There's stories of Jerry Lee when he was playing with the other kids. They would dare each other to do things, and there was nothing he wouldn't do. I seem to remember some story about the kids all being on a railroad track bridge, a trestle, and Jerry Lee said, I dare you guys to jump out off this trestle and grab some bar and hang from it. And the other kids were kind of looking at it like, that's a long way. And it was a very long way down below to the water and the rocks, and it was probably, a one-way ticket. And Jerry Lee, none of them would do it, and they're like, well, why don't you do it? And Jerry Lee didn't even hesitate. Jumped out there and grabbed it and swung around, called everybody cowards. And a person who just simply does that sort of thing. Normal people don't do that. And people with sense don't do that. But Jerry Lee did. And you could see where that followed him throughout his life. And he's definitely the perfect example of digging the art and not feeling so great about the artist sometimes. I've struggled with that many times. But after my dad passed away, when I listen to those country records, it's a connection to my dad, and it's a weird thing to have that connection with a person that you don't feel so great about in some ways. But man, his music was just wonderful. I think he was a pure instrument. When you think of someone who music is just absolute, comes out of them in the most natural way possible. Like when he would sing, his singing voice is just amazing to me, and his piano playing. but it just comes out so natural. And all those records are just recorded live on the floor. The band's all playing live. He's singing live. He wouldn't do takes over and over. It's just what he gives you is what you got. And man, just sounds. I think this sounded great, and I think it's of the best country music ever recorded. I think that's where Jerry Lee's country records fit in right there. And that's not even to mention the rock and roll stuff from the Sun era and all that. He's my favorite artist from, the Sun Records catalog. It would be Jerry Lee stuff, I believe. But years and years later, Jerry Lee Lewis came to Indianapolis, and my buddy Todd and I were going to go check out the show. And we bought tickets to see Jerry Lee, and he was playing it was a music venue that was inside a shopping mall downtown, and there were very nice people that owned it and ran it and worked there, but it's a very imperfect place to see a rock and roll show. And we were looking forward to seeing Jerry Lee, but we were just looking forward to seeing a person. This is the person, but we weren't expecting a great musical experience. And we showed up. You walk through the mall, and we got there, and it was a good crowd. It was a really good crowd. And Todd and I were like, "What the hell, man? Let's go down front." And we got to the very front of the stage, and Jerry Lee Lewis walks out and starts playing. And I swear he is sitting at his piano, like 3.5, 4 feet away from me, and he's just playing. And as the set starts to get going, you just kind of realize this is good. This is really good. And he would play a song, and there towards the end, he'd just kind of get bored, and he'd throw up his hand. Everybody would stop, and then he'd play something else. As soon as he was bored with it and done with it, he would stop and move on to the next song. And James Burton came out, and he was playing with him. I remember when he walked out, I'm like, "That's James Burton in the band. What the hell?" And Kenny Lovelace. I'm trying to think of who else might have been with him that night. But as the set went on, he would just ask people, "Hey, what do you want to hear?" And I'm thinking, man, I want to request something, but I'm just kind of dumbfounded at how much I'm enjoying the show, and I just couldn't say anything at all. This woman next to me says, "She even woke me up to say goodbye." And he goes, "Oh, that's a good one there." And he starts it off, and he plays, "She even woke me up to say goodbye." And somebody says, "What made Milwaukee famous?" And, "Oh, we'll play that one for you." He plays that. And as a kid, I was always confused by that song, because when we would watch professional wrestling, the Crusher was billed as the man that made Milwaukee famous. The Crusher, the man that made Milwaukee famous. Well, the song says, "What made Milwaukee famous has made a loser out of me." So somehow in my overactive imagination, I had convinced myself that Jerry Lee Lewis and the Crusher had a problem with each other. And I was always wondering who would win. I wasn't the brightest kid. But back to this show. It was absolutely phenomenal. I mean, it was really, really great to sit that close. And somewhere towards the end of the show, he looks down, he kind of stands up and offers out his hand, and he's looking at people, and he starts shaking hands with people in the front row. He's shaking hands with them, and then he looks over at me, and I'm looking back, eye to eye with Jerry Lee Lewis, the soundtrack of my childhood. And he reaches out, and he shook my buddy Todd's hand, and then he reached over and he shook mine. I shook his hand 40 years after my dad shook his hand, and it was just amazing. I just can't say that enough. When the show was over, I thought about it, and I was thinking to myself, I think this is the greatest rock and roll show I have ever seen, put on by a man who's 70 years old, or however old he was. And I just was thinking about it. We were driving. Todd and I had a trip planned when we bought these tickets. So we left from, midnight or whenever in Indianapolis, and drove to Chattanooga all night. And as we drove on, we just started talking about it. It's like, that really was amazing, wasn't it? And it's like, yeah, it was. And as time went on, and I just thought about it a little more, it still is the greatest rock and roll show I've ever seen. And I think there's a lot of people out there when they talk about Jerry Lee Lewis and when they talk about the greatest rock and roll show they've ever seen. I bet there's a hell of a lot of people who would say Jerry Lee Lewis' show was the best that they'd ever witnessed. And it's kind of weird at this moment, first time in my life, to not have Jerry Lee Lewis in there, but you know, all I really had was the records, and those were the things that I loved anyway, and that connection to my dad. So I'd like to know, have you seen Jerry Lee? Was it great? I know he's played a lot of clunkers also, but what's your favorite Jerry Lee Lewis song? What's your favorite era album? Tell me about the show you saw. And my favorite part about that movie that they made about him was at Great Balls of Fire, was at the end when they said, somewhere in America tonight, Jerry Lee Lewis is, playing a show, playing his heart out on the piano. I love that ending to the movie. But anyway, tell me your experiences, and I'll see you somewhere down the road. Much love to you.